Netlify just sent me a $104,000 bill for a simple static site. I didn't want to talk about this today. I'll be honest, it came up a bunch during my stream, but it is going around enough and there's enough not great info that I wanted to jump on it and try and steer the conversation in a slightly better direction. Before anyone says it, yes, I'm sponsored by Vercel. This video is certainly not sponsored. They probably don't even want me to make it, but I want to jump in on this conversation to highlight both the things these companies are doing right and also the things they're not, because this problem is certainly not exclusive to Netlify. So first, I want to talk about this problem. Then I want to give context based on other similar problems that I've seen with these newer startups and their pricing models causing people to be hit with really big unexpected bills, and then the different solutions that I've seen all of these different companies employing. So let's dive in. This poor dev received an email last weekend saying that they had a $104,500 bill overdue. At first, they assumed it was just some phishing scheme or some stuff, but that was not the case. As they show in the image here, they had insane bandwidth usage that ended up being worth a total of $104,000. Yeah, not good. They were not hyped, and they thought, okay, maybe I got DDoS attacked. Since Netlify charges $55 per 100 gigs for the exceeding bandwidth, the peak day had this amount, which was 60.7 terabytes of traffic in a day. I mean, it's not impossible. Why attack a simple static site like mine? The site has been on Netlify for 4 years and is always okay with the free tier. The monthly bandwidth never exceeded even 10 gigs and has only 200 daily visitors. The DDoS attack was focused on a file on their site. Yes, it's partly their fault because they put a 3.4 meg size sound file on their site rather than using a third-party platform like SoundCloud, but still, this doesn't invalidate the point of having protection against such attacks and limiting the spending. We got a lot more to dig into here. The big failure here that I want to call out, like without question, the biggest failure in this post by a lot, by the company of Netlify, is the point here. When they initially got in touch with this developer, the default offer was to charge 20%. But since the amount was so large, they offered to only charge 5%. So you only have to spend $5,000 because somebody abused his website. That's absurd. I want to be very clear. A $5,000 bill on a hobby project out of nowhere because somebody found a big file on your site is incredibly unacceptable on every single level, and this should not happen. Obviously, the $100,000 bill shouldn't happen, but the fact that support's offer was to take this thing that failed this developer and offer them a discount instead of jumping on the issue, that's horrifying. Thankfully, Netlify's understood that and they've responded accordingly, but one step at a time. This feels more like a scam to me. Why do serverless platforms like Netlify and Vercel not have DDoS protection or at least a spend limit? They should have alerted me if the spending skyrocketed. I checked my inbox and spam folder and found nothing. The only email is extra usage package purchased for bandwidth. Feels like they deliberately not support these features so they can cash grab in situations like this. I want to break this one down sentence by sentence because I have so many feelings about so much of this. This feels like a scam. I understand being in that position. When suddenly you get a bill that's like 5 digits more than you were expecting, you have every right and reason to feel like this is a scam, and you should, and I understand. This company does not intend to charge you this much, and you know that now, but I understand the feeling. Why do serverless platforms like Netlify and Vercel not have DDoS protection, or at least a spend limit? They do have DDoS protection. They have a bunch of it. If they didn't, this would happen every day. This happened to me once about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago now. I actually have my video pulled up here when I got DDoS for 2 weeks while on Vercel. They did a similar thing where they targeted the biggest thing they could find, which was like a 0.5 megabyte JS bundle. And they just fetched it constantly on whatever network they were using and racked up a bill for us that would have been like $100-something if I recall. And we told Vercel they used the opportunity to improve their servers and handle these types of attacks better because they had a bunch of data from new IP addresses that never attacked before and used that to improve their filters. So the traffic that we were getting hit with went down really quickly as a result of their mitigations, and we didn't pay anything. Some amount of this is because I'm close with Vercel, for sure, but I promise you, if I had tweeted, I would have gotten the same exact treatment here. You can choose to believe me or not, I understand, but I'm going to go into some things Vercel has absolutely fucked up as we keep going on. So call me biased now, listen for a bit longer, please. They should have alerted me if the spending skyrocketed. Yes, they should have. Them not doing this is a massive failure. I get emails like every day from Vercel of random things that we broke the limits of. I probably have the settings set bad or they just over notify. I will say that having a signal that goes off too often is often just as bad as having no signal at all because it trains you to ignore the signal so you don't do anything when it happens. So It's a hard balance to find, but clearly Netlify's not there yet. Even Vercel's not, in my opinion. They said they checked their inbox and spam and found nothing yet. If this is the case, if they actually didn't get any notifications as these bandwidth tiers were being hit and expanded over, yeah, anytime billing goes up more than 20%, you should get a notification of it. So that's absurd. The only email is extra usage package purchased for bandwidth. Yeah, no, this part alone, it doesn't matter if he actually abused the service himself or whatever caused that bill. If he was not notified that his bill was going up that much, that is enough of a reason for it to be wiped. For the response to this to be a discount, even if everything was on the customer's fault, unacceptable. But that's not what happened here. It wasn't his fault. The platform should have done more, which again, we will talk more about as we go on. There are 3 different ways or more here where Netlify's individual failures enough of a reason for them to cover the cost. The support flub is enough of a reason, not notifying them is enough of a reason, and DDoSing being a problem that they're the ones who should be solving is probably the most important reason. We'll go through them all as we keep going. This is the part I disagree with the most, though. It feels like they deliberately do not support these features so they can cash grab in situations like this. I need you guys to understand a huge, important thing. They don't want this. They don't want to charge individual developers a lot of money, as much as $100,000 feels like to one of us in a hobby project, because that's like most, if not more than our salary. That's nothing compared to the multi-million-dollar contracts they're signing with big businesses. And if those big businesses have employees that are hearing about this company being a scam and doing all these weird cash grab things, they're not going to be able to sign those contracts. The optics hit and the potential loss of deals these companies have to deal with as a result of these instances, the company would pay the difference tenfold to never deal with it. I promise you that if they had the option to flick a switch and just handle these problems, no matter what the cost is, they would do it. But it's not that simple. The goal of these companies isn't to refuse spend limits so that you accidentally spend way too much money. They don't want to build a service where your site goes down. They don't want to accidentally build a thing where the default use case is your thing goes down if it does well. Because most websites start with no traffic and then have a bunch of traffic. Most of the biggest websites in the world start that way. Even when you deploy a new instance of Twitter, when you're updating the web app, it gets no traffic and then it gets a lot of traffic. You can't just automate that. We're already going down tangents. I need to just finish this post. As he said, the attack was focused on the sound file, which again, be very careful about putting large files in platforms and providers like Vercel and Cloudflare and Netlify. Cloudflare, if you're using R2, is fine, but the bandwidth costs can get bad quick. On Vercel and Netlify, it's way worse. I hate to self-plug, but this is why we built Upload Thing, because not everything should be part of your GitHub repo, and that includes this file. That said, if you put it in your GitHub repo and the repo is open source, you can just link to the GitHub asset and not even have it deployed through Vercel. But every asset that goes on Vercel or Netlify is optimized on a CDN, globally distributed, to have the best possible performance when somebody fetches it. Because usually the thing you're putting up there isn't an MP3, it's a CSS file or an SVG or something that you want to have it load fast more than you want it to load cheap. Because if you put your site in just a random GitHub bucket or you put it on something like S3, it's going to be way slower than if you put it on Cloudflare or Vercel. But a 3.4 meg MP3 file is not something you should put there because a little bit of latency to fetch that file is not a big thing to eat. They don't communicate these things well enough, and if you make these types of mistakes, you get screwed for it, which is incredibly unfair, and both platforms need to work on this. I know Vercel is doing some big overhauls with how the pricing for bandwidth goes. Hopefully that will be officially announced soon. I'm sure that Netlify is working on it too, just from the responses I've seen here. But as you guys see here, this post went super viral. 8,000 upvotes on the web dev subreddit is nuts. It also went viral on HN. There was a really good response from the CEO of Netlify on HN. Our support team has reached out to the user from the thread to let them know they're not going to get charged for this. It's currently our policy to not shut down free sites during traffic spikes that don't match attack patterns, but instead forgiving any bills for legitimate mistakes after the fact. Apologies that this didn't come through in our initial support reply. Yeah, the initial support reply was such a big failure, but it's not one that only they have made. Here's where I'm going to rail on Vercel a little bit. This is one that I'm particularly sensitive about because, and I haven't shared this story before because I haven't had a good reason to. Poor Mike Ramirez actually shared this story in my Discord when it first happened. The issue he had was a massive bill because he had a recursive call in an Astro app he was building where the Astro server was generating a page by calling the Astro back into APIs, and it kept calling itself recursively and ended up racking up an insane bill. When he hit up support, they said, no, this is compute you ran. You're eating that. And he came to my Discord to vent a bit about it. I said, wait, what the fuck? Tried to raise this with Vercel. I didn't put enough effort in. I just gave them a very, very brief heads up. which was not enough because it didn't get resolved. He then made what I would consider the fair decision of going public with the awful experience he had here. That happened almost a year ago now, but it was not good. Vercel had said it was a runaway process or uncaught exceptions in their code, which caused subsequent failures, which cost $500 an hour. He had no idea the bill was continuously growing, and it could have easily cost $30K in a few days if he hadn't jumped on it as quick as he did. It was just a test project too. It wasn't facing the public or anything. This was really, really bad. Like, really, really bad. I was incredibly upset with how this was handled. Thankfully, they have more than addressed it. I honestly think this issue that Mike experienced, even though it wasn't a DDoS or external abuse, it was an honest mistake that he made using the platform. Vercel really changed their policy around these things at this time. They refunded the overages, obviously, and they identified the root cause, which we, as mentioned before, this page was calling itself. They have since made changes on Vercel such that you can't just recursively call the same endpoint from a given endpoint. It detects when that happens and it throws. It's so aggressive with that it's actually caused us some problems with upload thing when we do that intentionally. That's another long aside. But they went out of their way to make this way harder to happen. And it only could happen because of what they describe here as the classic plain Swiss cheese failure, where it's not that any of these things are entirely full of holes. It's that every layer had enough holes that if they all happened to align, then a hole goes through the whole cheese. Yeah, that's what happened here. And they fully acknowledged it. Guillermo wrote this great reply. They jumped on it. He actually, if I recall, hopped on a Zoom with poor Mike after all of this to chat and make sure it was going to be handled well. They took this one very seriously, and I've seen a pretty significant change since then. We saw this change when yet another Michael, seems like a cursed name for weird bills, had an issue where somebody spammed his Stripe account, causing 56,000 fake accounts that immediately bounced and never completed their transactions to be created. And when that happened, Stripe was calling webhooks to his Vercel service, which caused his Vercel service bill to spike an absurd amount. Yeah, his Vercel bill hit $23,000. The reason for that is a little more subtle than you would think. To go back to the DDoSing point, even if Vercel had the best DDoSing protection in the entire world, that would not have fixed anything here because Vercel cannot block Stripe webhooks. If there's any code path in which Vercel can block Stripe webhooks, that will instantaneously cause many services to fail when they go viral, at which point people trying to build things that will explode and go viral will never touch Vercel again. If the defaults on Vercel prevent Stripe from calling Vercel, or if the defaults from Vercel prevent new developers who had a project blow up from having their site work on Vercel, and obviously Netlify is the same here too, those services don't work for the users they are targeting. If you can't go from 0 users to 1 million users, then it's not the right solution. As such, no level of DDoS protection is going to prevent the problem here. The problem here is a little bit more subtle. If I had to split the blame on this one, I would say it's like 80% Stripe, 10 to 15% the dev, and 5 to 10% Vercel, but very much Stripe. They should not allow for this type of abuse on their platform and then forwarding that on to other platforms. That's absurd. I've even had issues with Stripe not giving you good enough notifications about when a payment isn't completed or is failed early and all these types of things. Again, Guillermo, CEO of Vercel, jumps in. Following up here, we've concluded our investigation. TLDR will be issuing a full refund for the excess compute charges as we've determined a path forward for you and others to not fall into this problem. For more context in the broader community, the endpoint attackers targeted caused a large number of transactions on the Stripe side. This alone wasn't a big problem, except that Stripe then fired a huge number of webhooks that later got retried many times. The endpoint responding to those webhooks hosted on Vercel side was not rate limited and timed out. So a couple important things here. Rate limiting the Stripe endpoint is probably not a great idea because if you have an actual spike of actual customers, you want to be able to actually handle that. As such, just adding a rate limiter or DDoSing to that endpoint would not be good. It would be very bad for many businesses. They will not do that. They should not do that. They have not done that. The issue here was more subtle, as I had mentioned before. The events that were hitting this endpoint were being spammed a ton, being retried a ton, and most importantly, as they call out, the biggest part of why his particular bill was so big was that he wasn't handling the event types that were being sent. So he was handling new purchase events and probably cancellation events, but incomplete purchase events he wasn't handling. And instead of returning a response, he just quietly let it fail, which if you don't return a response when you're processing a request in a Lambda, it hangs until it dies. And because of that, he was hitting the 60-second timeout on every single one of those requests that would then get thrown into a retry loop on the Stripe side, which would cause the chaos that he experienced. That sucks. And as Guillermo calls out here, It's important to have a shared responsibility model over the resources that they manage. Our first action when we hear reports like these and escalations in socials is to evaluate whether we did everything possible on our end to prevent the situation. That's why it took us some time to reply, and I appreciate your patience. In this case, we've identified 2 opportunities for the platform improvement. If Vercel had implemented these before, your runway usage would have been vastly mitigated. For this reason, we've decided to proceed with a refund of the excess compute charges. We recommend looking into our spend management tools for further peace of mind, as well as tuning your max duration down significantly to reduce the impact of upstream timeouts. Again, 60-second timeouts, not good. And please make sure all of your endpoints respond with something. You don't want to have an endpoint just hanging for a long time. Respond to your requests, please. Regardless, they refunded it. Stripe absolutely fucked up here and needs to jump on it, like badly. This type of fraud should not be something they even kind of enable. They should be the ones adding these tools in front. But I honestly don't think there's much that Vercel could have done here other than better notifications and handling those default timeouts better. Like that's about it here. That said, I saw so many dumb takes around this one, like this is why everything should be hosted on a single server, or this is why it's a bad idea to use services like this. Just do everything on Cloudflare and AWS yourself. Well, the bad news is, in this case, this caused the site to potentially cost too much, but he got his money back. In other cases, this would have taken the site down. An attacker like this would prevent other users from using the service at all. And it's the same case with spend limits. If you say, I won't spend more than $100 a month, what happens to the user on the $101st? The site doesn't load for them. And that's not an acceptable compromise. I use Vercel and Netlify and companies like this because I don't want my shit to go down. I'm paying the money to keep it from going down. And I don't want it to go down because it hit a certain threshold. I want to know that my spend went up a bunch and adjust accordingly. This one came from a poll that Fred from Astro ran, which was on a front-end hosting platform like Vercel or Netlify or Cloudflare Pages, who was ultimately responsible for malicious and DDoS traffic. This question by itself is really complex because in the past, we could just rely on like Cloudflare's DDoS DNS protection layer. But when you throw Cloudflare on top of things like Netlify or Vercel, you're not running 2 DNSs, and it's, to be frank, a shit show. It just doesn't work great. I personally went through hell a few years ago trying to use Cloudflare as a DDoS/DNS layer in front of a Vercel app. Specifically, it would serve a cached HTML page that was pointing to a JavaScript file that no longer existed on my Vercel deployment. And since Cloudflare had only cached the HTML, not the JavaScript, it would fail to resolve and you get an empty white page. Yeah, not good at all. Genuinely disappointing that it was as unreliable as it was. That's a rant for another day. The reason I bring it up is you can't really put something in front of these platforms to prevent this type of DDoSing. You can prevent things like someone spamming your endpoint by implementing rate limiters, and you should do that. Check out the Upstash rate limiter. I love it. I use it for all of my stuff, but you can't use that at a high enough level to prevent the types of attacks we're talking about here. What happened with the instance earlier that we were talking about with the Netlify bill is somebody was downloading a file maliciously. As a developer, you can't really do much about that on these platforms. With Cloudflare, you can implement that in front to prevent those types of things, but you can't really implement it in front of Vercel or Netlify. As such, I would make the argument these responsibilities fall on the platforms, specifically because these platforms are promising an easy experience for developers to adopt, grow, and scale. And if their promise isn't protecting them in the same way something like Cloudflare would, ideally even better than something like Cloudflare would, they're failing that promise. And that's why I'm so heated, because I personally do expect these platforms to do this, including my sponsor, Vercel, who is probably going to be upset with me for this video, but I also think they're doing a good job here, so we'll see how that goes. I wanted to highlight Matt's reply here because I actually think it was phenomenal. And I have personally had nothing but great experiences with Matt. He's clearly a very smart dude that gets this industry better than almost anyone. And he's also been incredibly kind to me. So there are my biases. When a spike in traffic can be automatically and absolutely classified as malicious, our platform is set up to block this. If it's a new pattern, we'll add it to the automated rules and waive the charges. This is the experience I've had with Vercel too. This is how it tends to work with hosting platforms. It's tricky when the traffic in question is not clearly malicious, but could be an indication of a customer being successful. In this case, any automatic blocks could mean ruining a launch, making a viral campaign go bad, or disappointing fans of an emerging artist, etc. Very, very true. Like, this is going to be a silly example, but I think you'll understand. Kendrick Lamar, the famous rapper, had a team that used Next.js and Vercel to launch his new album announcement. That could very easily have had an MP3 embedded in it, and they would not want that to go down no matter what. They would happily spend the amounts of money that these customers were seeing in their bills, but then they would probably negotiate if it was actually being done maliciously or incorrectly. How does this company detect the difference between these types of things? It's not easy. In this case, I'm almost certain that this was a DDoS attack. I think he says otherwise as we go down, which we will get to. It's still hard to detect. And this is not an easy thing to get right. I think he should have gotten a warning that he was uploading an asset that was more than a meg that said, hey, maybe you should put this somewhere else. But just locking out the site when the traffic levels hit a certain point, that's not a solution. As Matt says here, for free users, my philosophy has always been that we can never go back and fix it if we ruin your moment of glory, but we can always cancel an invoice or refund a charge. Our support team does their best to identify these situations in advance of a user even being made aware that they happened. This is huge. I really like the framing of we can never go back and fix it if we ruin your moment of glory, but we can always cancel an invoice or refund a charge. Think about how much worse it would be if a customer was going viral and Netlify cut them off because they were concerned their spend got too high. That's something you can't fix. You lost the moment as a result of a bad default that they had set. They don't do that because they can just refund you if things go wrong. Their support failed to make the correct identification and recognition in this instance, but they can fix it. And these companies building in a way where you can fix things when they go wrong instead of they break incredibly badly when they go wrong is the right decision. And I don't like that the response to this is we should go back to building in ways where your site goes down if it gets too much traffic. We should go back to building in ways where any individual with a big enough botnet or wallet can make your site go off the internet. I don't think we should live that way. And I think these services are offering something awesome in the way they prevent that and how they handle these things when they go wrong. Does it suck that you have to go viral on Reddit to get a response from Netlify? Yes, but I don't think you'll have to the next time due to how big this one went. I know you don't have to right now at Vercel due to how big the last few went to. In this specific case, the user posted about a large bill they received. We've been clear that while it was an incredibly rare situation, we should have done better. A bill this large should never have left our system automatically, and our support team should not have treated this as a business user. We also should not have speculated that this was a DDoS attack, since in this case, the traffic does match organic traffic from a region with lots of old devices. No, bullshit. I hate, because I agree with so much of this. Someone might have a botnet of old phones in some random region. I sincerely doubt that's what happened here. The traffic might seem like organic patterns, but that's by design of the attacker. This is way too suspicious, and I know that the poster actually called this out too. I'm still curious who orchestrated the attack, and they said they're still researching the incident. Their support hasn't come back to me with the IP information I asked yet, so I posted on Twitter to ask the CEO. Really appreciate your quick action on the matter. Talk to the collaborators. We agree that this one trying to find out the attacker behind this. I've asked this in our support email thread. No response. Full list of source IPs hitting the MP3 file, a few dozen samples of the request headers, any indication that would make it appear that it's a crawl, connection durations, number of simultaneous requests, egress charts over time, which POPs serve the request if they have localized DNS. I really don't want to be negative towards this dev that experienced this, because that's not my intent here at all. When something this big happens, and especially when it gets this much attention, it's easy to get fully invested and obsessed and like it's the only thing you're thinking about. I can't even imagine that not happening, especially if this thing just blew up as quickly as it did here. I hate to say this, but like, just chill. It's fine. The info you need to help figure this out, if it exists, will come. But I still don't know the IP addresses or the patterns of the people who've been DDoSing me on and off for 3 years now. This shit happens. I can't imagine the person who had the $27,000 bill has any information on who was attacking him on Stripe. I promise you that poor Michael Aubrey has no idea who was harassing him on Stripe. And I've seen a few other people be hit with this since. Sometimes malicious people, I believe in this case it's just one person or a small group of people, they love trolling tech Twitter and Reddit and YouTube and all these things and just going at their services to see if they can destroy them. I'm lucky that I've handled a lot of these attacks. I've seen others like poor Inkdrop that did not survive the same attacks and ended up going down for some amount of time. It sucks. We don't get to know much about it because usually it's computers and devices that have been hacked by some bad actor. But that's kind of just the reality of these situations. And it sucks and it feels awful. And you're going to sit there hating and being frustrated with this company constantly. But I need you to understand it's really, honestly, not that big of a deal. Your bill is being refunded. It sucks. And it's going to feel like the biggest and worst thing that ever happened. But you survived it. It's over. And anyone else who has an experience like this, same deal. Take a step back. Chill out for a minute. Your bill's been refunded. And if not, it probably almost certainly will be. And if it doesn't get refunded, go public and it probably will. When these things happen, it's a failure of the company and a mistake and a malicious thing. And these companies don't want the optics hit of these things. They absolutely don't. That's why they jump on it as hard as they do. It's okay. And I'm upset that these one-off instances become the reason to not use a service, even though these one-off instances both get harder and harder to have happen in the first place every single time one happens, and also get refunded every single time. If anything, I would make the argument that issues like this dev experienced are the reason to use platforms like Netlify and Vercel, because when a massive bill you didn't expect gets hit, you get refunded. As a long-time AWS customer, I can tell you that's not usually the case. This one frustrated me. One more quick thing. I just saw it when I was checking Guillermo's tweets. Coming soon, more ways to protect your Vercel workloads from malicious traffic. They're doing this. The work is being put in to not just get Netlify and Vercel to the same point that Cloudflare's DDoS protection is, but to get it to the point where we as devs don't have to worry about this at all anymore. There might even be a future where we don't have to set up rate limiters through something like Upstash and their awesome JS package, and instead we can just rely on Vercel to do it. They're not 100%. Nothing is 100% in this chaotic world of hackers and cat and mouse games destroying our services. But that's not the point. The point is to make reasonable decisions, knowing the reasonable outcomes of them, and to not worry about something that won't actually cost you money because it was a mistake. If the reason you're not using Netlify or Vercel is because of these stories of runaway bills, you're not making a good decision. If your reason for not using these services is because the multiplier of how much they cost is greater enough than the thing that you want to do or plan to do otherwise, and your costs are going to be high enough that the additional time spent to use that thing is worth it to you, and the possibility of getting DDoS is something you have a plan for, mitigation strategy for, and the ability to deal with the costs of, yeah, don't use Vercel or Netlify. But if any of those things aren't true, these solutions, even in these scenarios, still seem to prove themselves as the best way to go. That's all I have to say about this one. I'm sorry for getting frustrated. I get annoyed because these companies did make mistakes. And rather than talk about the mistakes they made, like Netlify absolutely destroying things on the support side, they did not handle support well here at all. And the CEO had to jump in and handle it himself. Or on Vercel's side, the fact that timeouts weren't being handled aggressively enough or notifying the user well enough. And as a result, they had a workload and flows that probably would have racked up like $800, which isn't good. That ended up being like 30 grand, which is way worse. That ended up being money Vercel had to pay, so I'm sure they're focused on fixing that. But again, none of these things ended up costing the customer money. They cost them stress, waking up to a scary looking number. But every time that happens, it gets handled. And that's why I wanted to make this video. That's why I took the time to yell at my computer for half an hour after streaming for 6 hours. That's why I'm making a video I didn't want to make, because I'm genuinely frustrated with how these things are being used. There are lots of good reasons to not use Vercel. This isn't one of them. And there are lots of good reasons to not use Netlify. And the way Matt handled this is certainly not one either. Their support's a good reason, but not this. Peace, nerds.